The most expensive building in our community was already finished before anyone asked the one question that mattered: who actually owned the land beneath it? I never expected a quiet lake on my property to become the center of a $4 million dispute, but that was exactly what happened when the HOA announced their newest community project. For years I had owned a piece of land beside a peaceful lake that had been part of my property records for decades. It was not a place I thought about every day. It was simply part of my home, part of the landscape I had taken care of for years. Then one morning, I saw construction crews working near the shoreline. The HOA President, Caroline Hayes, proudly introduced the project as a new luxury lodge for the neighborhood. She explained that the building would become a gathering place for residents, complete with meeting areas, event spaces, and a view overlooking the water. Everyone seemed excited. The community believed this was a major improvement that would increase the value of every home nearby. I understood why people were happy. A beautiful lodge could bring people together. But when I looked closer at the location, I noticed something that did not make sense. The structure was not just near the lake. Parts of the project appeared to extend into an area connected to my property records. I did not accuse anyone. I did not make a public complaint. I simply asked one question: had anyone verified who owned the lakebed? Caroline told me the HOA had reviewed the neighborhood plans and approved everything through the proper channels. She believed the documents were clear and that the project was moving exactly as planned. But there was one thing she did not mention. The HOA had reviewed development maps, not the original ownership records. That difference seemed small, but it could change everything. I decided to look through my own files and compare them with the county records. Inside an old storage box, I found documents that had been passed down with the property. Among them was a survey map showing boundaries that did not match the assumptions being used for the lodge project. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Why did the HOA believe the lake belonged to the community? Had anyone ever checked the actual ownership history? And why was a $4 million building already so far along before someone verified the most basic detail? The grand opening ceremony was only weeks away. The entire community was preparing to celebrate a project they believed was completely secure. But I knew that before anyone cut the ribbon, there was something important they needed to see. Because the truth about the lake was not hidden in a new construction plan. It was hidden in a document that had been overlooked for years. The first thing I did after finding the old survey was not call the HOA or make a public announcement. I knew that if I wanted the truth, I needed more than a suspicion. I needed documents that could answer the questions clearly. I spent the next few days comparing the old property records with the newer development plans. The more I looked, the more I realized that the problem was not a simple misunderstanding. There were several layers of information that had never been connected. The HOA had relied on neighborhood maps that showed the lake as part of the community landscape. Those maps were useful for planning, but they did not prove ownership of the land beneath the water. That distinction was something most people never think about. A lake can look like one thing from the surface while the legal ownership underneath can tell a completely different story. I decided to request the official county records connected to the property boundaries. When the records arrived, I found an important detail. The original survey from decades earlier separated the shoreline area from the lakebed itself. The document showed that the ownership history was more complicated than the HOA planning materials suggested. I also discovered that the lake had been included in several community discussions over the years, but nobody had completed a full ownership verification before the lodge project began. The information changed how I viewed the situation. I no longer saw it as just a disagreement between a homeowner and an HOA. It was a much bigger issue about how a major project could move forward without confirming every important detail. Meanwhile, the HOA continued preparing for the grand opening. Caroline Hayes announced updates to residents and shared the progress of the lodge construction. She believed the project represented years of planning and would become a centerpiece of the neighborhood. I understood why she was confident. From her perspective, every document she had reviewed supported the project. But confidence and accuracy are not always the same thing. A document can be official and still not answer the exact question being asked. I decided to contact the HOA directly and request a conversation before the opening event. I wanted them to review the same records I had found. I was not trying to stop the community from having a beautiful gathering place. I only wanted everyone involved to know exactly what was being built and where it was being built. When we finally spoke, Caroline listened carefully but remained certain that the HOA had followed the correct process. She explained that the developer had submitted plans, the board had approved them, and construction had already reached a major stage. Then I showed her the old survey. For the first time, I saw her confidence change. She did not have an immediate answer because the document raised a question nobody on the board had considered before. The grand opening was approaching quickly, and now there was another mystery waiting to be solved. If the Lakebed ownership was different from what the HOA believed, who had approved the construction without checking it first? Before the grand opening, we need one answer. Who actually owns the ground beneath this lake? That was the question I asked during my meeting with the HOA board, and it was the moment when a celebration started turning into a serious review of the facts. I placed the old survey documents on the table and explained that the issue was not about stopping the lodge project or creating conflict with the neighborhood. The issue was that a $4 million structure was being prepared for the public without anyone confirming one important detail. The Lakebed ownership had never been fully verified. Caroline Hayes listened carefully, but she still believed the HOA had done everything correctly. She explained that the board had approved the lodge after reviewing development plans, engineering information, and community documents. From her point of view, the process had been followed. But I pointed out something important. A development plan shows what someone intends to build. It does not always prove who owns the land where the building will stand. That difference became the center of the entire situation. After our meeting, the HOA agreed to review the county records. The timing could not have been more important because the grand opening ceremony was only 3 weeks away. Invitations had already been sent, residents were excited, and the lodge was almost ready to become the newest feature of the community. The pressure was increasing because every day brought the event closer. During the county review, another detail appeared. The developer had received approval based on property information provided during the planning process, but the records did not include a specific confirmation of Lakebed ownership. This was the first major discovery that changed how everyone viewed the situation. It was not just a disagreement between me and the HOA. It was a missing step in a process that involved multiple people. I continued searching through historical records because I wanted to understand how this mistake happened. In an old county archive, I found references to previous ownership discussions involving the lake area. The documents suggested that the lake had always been treated carefully because the surface area and the land beneath it were not necessarily the same thing. That discovery created a new question. If earlier records showed uncertainty, why did the current development process move forward without a deeper review? Caroline began asking the same questions. The confidence she had shown at the beginning was replaced by caution. She contacted the developer and requested every document connected to the lodge approval. Meanwhile, residents started hearing that the grand opening might face delays. Some were frustrated because they had been waiting for the new facility. Others wanted to know why such a large project had not included a complete ownership check from the beginning. Then the county called with an update. They had found another document connected to the original property survey, and it contained information that could finally explain why everyone had been working from different assumptions for so long. The answer was hidden in a record that had been overlooked for years. The county official placed the new document on the table and said something that changed the entire conversation. The original property records were never unclear, they were simply never reviewed by the people who approved the lodge. For the first time, everyone could see the difference between what the community believed and what the official records actually showed. The document was an updated survey reference from years earlier, and it connected the lakebed boundaries to a separate property record. It did not look dramatic at first glance. There were no large warnings or obvious signs that something was wrong. But hidden inside those measurements was the detail that had been missing from the entire project. The lake surface and the lakebed were not treated as the same ownership area. The HOA had built its plans around the appearance of the lake, not the legal description of the land underneath it. Caroline Hayes reviewed the document quietly. She asked the county officials several questions about how the mistake could have happened. The answer was simple but important. Different groups had reviewed different parts of the project. The developer focused on construction requirements. The HOA focused on community planning. The engineers focused on the building design. But nobody had connected all of those pieces with the original ownership records before construction began. That missing step created the problem everyone was now facing. The grand opening was getting closer, and the pressure was increasing. Residents wanted answers because they had already imagined the lodge becoming the center of community events. Some worried that the project would be delayed. Others wondered why such a major investment had moved forward without a complete ownership review. I understood their concerns because I never wanted the community to lose something they were excited about. My goal was never to stop the lodge. My goal was to make sure it existed on a foundation of accurate information. After the county review, the HOA board scheduled another meeting with residents. Caroline explained that new information had been discovered and that the board needed time to understand the legal details before moving forward. This was a major change from her original position. At the beginning, she believed the project was already settled. Now, she was asking the same questions I had asked weeks earlier. During the meeting, the developer presented the documents they had used during the planning process. They showed that the project team had relied on information provided during development approval. However, one critical piece was missing. There was no document confirming that the HOA had the right to build on the lakebed area connected to my property. The room became quiet as everyone realized the same thing. The problem was not a construction mistake. It was a verification mistake. Then another discovery surfaced. The county found an older communication between a previous consultant and the development team that mentioned the need to confirm ownership details before final approval. The message had been included in the project records but never received a full review. That single overlooked note raised a new question that nobody expected. If someone had already warned about checking ownership, why was the project allowed to continue without that confirmation? The discovery of the old consultant message changed the direction of the entire situation. Until that moment, everyone believed the problem came from missing information. But now there was evidence that someone had already identified the need for a deeper review before construction moved forward. The question was no longer only about who owned the lakebed. It was about how an important warning could exist in the project records and still be overlooked. The HOA board requested a complete review of every document connected to the lodge. Caroline Hayes contacted the developer and asked for the original planning files, approval records, and communication between all parties involved. For the first time since the project began, every person involved was looking at the same information instead of separate pieces of it. The review revealed something important. The developer had followed many of the normal steps required for a large community project, but the process focused heavily on building approval and community planning. Ownership verification for the lakebed was treated as a detail that would be confirmed later. That assumption became the biggest mistake in the entire project. A detail that seemed small at the beginning had become the foundation of a much larger problem. The grand opening was now only days away, and the community had to decide what to do next. Canceling the event would disappoint residents who had been waiting for the new lodge. Moving forward without answers could create even bigger problems later. Caroline faced a decision that was much more difficult than simply defending the HOA. She had to choose between protecting the image of the project or making sure the project was built on accurate information. During another meeting, she admitted that the board should have asked more questions before approving the construction plans. She explained that the HOA had trusted the information they received because it came through official channels. But official documents do not always answer every legal question. Sometimes the most important detail is the one nobody thinks to verify. I appreciated that change in attitude because my goal was never to embarrass anyone. I wanted the community to understand what had happened and make the right decision going forward. While the HOA continued reviewing records, I searched through additional family documents connected to the property. Inside another folder, I found a reference to a previous ownership agreement involving the lake area. The document did not solve everything, but it revealed another important piece of the puzzle. The history of the lake was more complicated than anyone realized. It appeared that ownership rights had been discussed many years earlier, but those details had not been carried into the current development records. That discovery opened a new mystery. If the ownership history had always been documented, why had the modern project relied on incomplete information? The county prepared to conduct a final review before the grand opening decision. Meanwhile, residents waited for answers, and the lodge remained at the center of the community debate. Then the county official called me with an update. They had found the original ownership record that could finally determine exactly who had the legal rights to the lakebed. The county official arrived with the document that everyone had been waiting for, and before he opened the file, I already knew this was the moment that would decide the future of the lodge. For weeks, everyone had been working with different pieces of information. The HOA had their development plans. The builder had their construction approvals. The residents had their expectations. But the one thing that connected everything together was the original ownership record. The county official explained that the document came from the earliest property records connected to the lake area. It showed the history of the land boundaries and clarified the difference between the visible water surface and the land beneath it. The lake looked like one complete feature, but legally, the ownership details were more specific. The record confirmed that the lakebed area connected to my property had never been transferred to the HOA or the development project. The room became quiet as everyone processed what that meant. The lodge had been planned with good intentions, but the foundation of those plans was based on an assumption that had never been verified. Caroline Hayes looked through the document carefully. This was not the outcome she expected when the project started, but she did not argue with the record. Instead, she asked the county official what options were available. That question showed how much the situation had changed. At the beginning, the HOA believed the matter was already settled. Now, they were focused on finding the correct solution. The county explained that the project did not have to disappear, but the ownership issue needed to be resolved properly. The HOA and developer would need to review agreements, adjust plans if necessary, and make sure every future step respected the actual property rights. The grand opening event was postponed, but the community reaction was different from what many people expected. Instead of blaming one person, residents began asking better questions about how the mistake happened. Some homeowners admitted they had assumed that a large project automatically meant every detail had already been checked. The situation became a lesson for the entire neighborhood. I also made it clear that I was not interested in preventing the lodge from existing. The lake had always been an important part of the area, and I understood why people wanted a place where the community could gather. My concern was simple. Any project built on or near private property should begin with accurate information and respect for ownership. After the county confirmed the records, the HOA board held another meeting. Caroline explained that the organization would create a new review process for future projects involving property boundaries and shared resources. She admitted that the board should have verified ownership before approving construction. That statement meant more than an apology because it showed that the lesson had been understood. But just when everyone thought the biggest question had been answered, the county official mentioned one more detail. During the review, they discovered another document connected to the original lake survey. It suggested that the ownership history had an additional layer that nobody had considered. The question was no longer only who owned the lakebed. The next question was what other information had been overlooked over the years. The discovery of another document connected to the original lake survey changed the way everyone viewed the situation. Until that moment, the community believed the ownership issue had been fully explained. The county record had confirmed the lakebed connected to my property, but now there was another question waiting to be answered. How had so many people reviewed the same area for years without discovering the complete history? The county official explained that the additional document was not a new ownership transfer. Instead, it was a historical reference showing how the lake boundaries had been handled by previous property owners. It revealed that the area had always required careful attention because the shoreline, water surface, and Lakebed were connected but not always treated as the same legal property. This information helped explain why the mistake had lasted so long. People were looking at the same lake, but they were looking through different documents. The HOA saw a community feature. The developer saw a construction opportunity. The residents saw a place to gather. But the original property records showed details that needed to be considered before anyone made a final decision. Caroline Hayes requested a complete timeline of how the lodge project moved from an idea to construction. The board reviewed meeting notes, planning documents, and communications from the developer. What they found was not a single person making a careless decision. It was a series of small assumptions that eventually created a major problem. One person trusted a planning map. Another trusted an approval document. Someone else assumed ownership details had already been verified. Each step seemed reasonable on its own, but together they created a situation where a $4 million project was built without confirming one of the most important details. The grand opening date had already passed, and the lodge remained closed while the review continued. Some residents were disappointed, but many began to understand why taking extra time was necessary. They realized that opening a building was not just about finishing construction. It was about making sure the foundation of the project was correct in every way. I continued working with the county because I wanted a solution that protected everyone involved. I did not want the community to lose the lodge. I wanted the project to move forward with clear agreements and respect for property rights. During another meeting, Caroline surprised many residents when she publicly acknowledged that the HOA should have verified ownership before approving the plans. She explained that leadership was not about defending every decision. It was about correcting mistakes when new information appeared. That moment changed the relationship between the HOA and the community. The conflict that started with uncertainty began turning into a process of finding a responsible solution. But the county review was not finished yet. While examining the historical records, officials found one more detail that had not been discussed before. A previous agreement mentioned access rights connected to the lake area, and nobody knew whether those rights still applied to the current development. The question became more complicated. Ownership had been confirmed, but now everyone needed to understand what rights existed around that ownership. The access rights document became the final piece of the puzzle that everyone had been waiting to understand. For weeks, the community had focused on one question: who owned the lakebed? Now that ownership had been confirmed, a different question appeared. What rights existed around the property, and how could the lodge move forward without creating another problem? The county reviewed the historical agreement carefully. The document showed that previous property owners had discussed limited access connected to the lake area, but those rights were specific and did not automatically transfer to a large community development project. This detail changed the conversation again. The HOA had not only misunderstood ownership. They had also assumed that access connected to the lake could be used in the same way for a $4 million lodge. The difference between private access and community use became another important lesson for everyone involved. Caroline Hayes asked the county to explain what steps the HOA needed to take before reopening the project. The answer was clear. The HOA and developer needed a formal agreement that respected the ownership records and defined exactly how the property could be used. This was not the outcome anyone expected when the lodge was first announced, but it created a path forward that protected both the community and my rights as a property owner. The board scheduled a new meeting with residents to explain the updated plan. This time, the conversation was different. Instead of defending the original decision, Caroline focused on transparency. She explained that the HOA had learned an important lesson about verifying information before approving major projects. Many residents appreciated the change because they realized the problem was not caused by wanting a better community. The problem came from moving forward before every important question had been answered. I attended the meeting and shared the same message I had from the beginning. I was never against the lodge. I understood why people wanted a beautiful place to gather near the lake. My concern was making sure that a community project was built with respect for the property rights connected to it. The developer also presented a revised plan. The new proposal included updated agreements, clearer boundaries, and additional reviews for future projects involving private land. It took more time than anyone expected, but the process was finally moving in the right direction. Then another interesting detail appeared during the final county review. Officials noticed that the same type of ownership verification issue had appeared in other historical development records around the area. It was not the same situation, but it showed that old property information could easily become misunderstood when new projects were created years later. The county decided to recommend a broader review process for future developments. The lodge situation had started as a dispute, but it was becoming something larger. It was creating a new standard for how the community handled property records and development decisions. As the revised agreements moved closer to approval, everyone began looking toward the next step. The lodge could finally have a future, but before it reopened, one final decision remained. The community had to decide whether the building would represent a mistake that everyone wanted to forget, or a lesson that would change how they handled every project moving forward. The final decision about the lodge was made after months of questions, reviews, and conversations that changed the way the entire community looked at property ownership. When the updated agreement was completed, everyone involved finally had a clear understanding of what the project needed to move forward. The HOA, the developer, and I reached a solution that respected the original ownership records while allowing the community to continue enjoying the lake area. The lodge would remain part of the neighborhood, but only under terms that clearly recognized the rights connected to the property beneath it. For the first time since construction began, there was no uncertainty about who controlled the land and what permissions were required. Caroline Hayes presented the updated plan to the residents during a community meeting. This time, the message was different from the first announcement months earlier. Instead of focusing only on the excitement of a new building, she focused on the lessons learned during the process. She explained that the HOA had moved too quickly because everyone assumed the important details had already been confirmed. The experience showed the board that good intentions are not enough when property rights are involved. Careful review and accurate records have to come before major decisions. The residents responded positively because they saw that the final solution protected everyone. The HOA could still have its community space. The developer could complete the project. And I could keep the property rights that had always belonged to me. The lodge eventually opened with the proper agreements in place. The same building that once represented confusion became a reminder of why ownership records matter. People gathered there, attended events, and enjoyed the view of the lake, but now they did so knowing that every detail had been handled correctly. Looking back, I realized the biggest surprise was not discovering the ownership issue. The biggest surprise was how many people were affected by a single assumption. Nobody woke up one morning planning to create a complicated situation. The HOA believed they were improving the community. The developer believed they were following the approved process. The residents believed everything had already been checked. But one missing verification step created months of uncertainty. The experience changed the way I viewed conflicts like this. A disagreement does not always have to become a battle. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is slow down, find the facts, and allow the records to speak for themselves. Caroline later told me that the situation changed how she approached every future HOA project. Before approving anything involving private property, the board would now require a complete ownership review. That change was probably the most valuable result of everything that happened. The lodge was no longer just a building beside a lake. It became a reminder that communities are built on trust, but trust must be supported by accurate information. Years from now, people may forget the confusion surrounding the project. They may only see a beautiful lodge overlooking the water. But I will always remember the lesson hidden beneath the surface. Sometimes the most important part of a property is the part nobody takes the time to look at until someone finally asks the right question.